5 days after the funeral. 5 days after we buried my grandfather, my stepmother showed up at my door. She wasn't alone. Standing beside Linda was a man in a gray suit, holding a dark leather briefcase. I'd never seen him before. Linda spoke first. "Emily, this is Gerald Finch." She paused. "My attorney?" 10 minutes later. Gerald placed a stack of papers on my living room table. No condolences, no mention of Walter. Gerald simply opened the file. "This isn't a transfer of ownership." He spoke slowly. "It's only a temporary management agreement." I looked at the first page. My name, my father's name, and the lake house Walter had just left to me. "If I sign this, my father gets a say in what happens to the house?" Gerald nodded. "On certain decisions, yes." Linda leaned back in her chair. "We just want everything handled fairly." Then she looked straight at me. "You've had your own life for a long time, Emily. Your father was the one who stayed here with Walter." I didn't like hearing that, but I couldn't say. It was completely wrong. 13 years in the military had cost me a lot of time with my family. But those years had also taught me something. When someone wants you to react quickly, slow down. I pushed the papers back toward Gerald. "I'm not signing anything today." Gerald didn't argue. He simply capped his pen. Linda stared at me for a few seconds. Then she stood. Before walking out the door, she turned back. "Emily, don't turn this into a war." I didn't answer, because until that moment, I'd never called it a war. Linda was the first one who did, after they left. The papers were still sitting on the table. Walter had been buried only 5 days ago, and yet the paperwork was already prepared. An attorney had already been hired, and my father hadn't even called me once to talk about any of it. I was about to read the first page again, when my phone buzzed. "Harold Kessler, Walter's longtime attorney." I answered. "Harold?" He didn't say hello, he just asked. "Emily, Linda was just at your house, wasn't she?" I looked toward the door. "How did you know?" "Gerald Finch contacted my office this morning. He asked for documents related to Walter's estate." I looked down at the papers. "So you knew they were coming?" "No," Harold answered. Then he said, "But Walter was worried something like this might happen." I looked up. "My grandfather told you that?" A pause. Harold answered. "He didn't just tell me." He stopped for a moment. "He prepared for it." I stared at the papers in front of me. "Prepared how?" Harold didn't answer that question. "First, don't sign anything Linda gives you. Then, pull up the security camera footage from your living room." I frowned. "The camera? Go back to the part where you left the room." I still didn't understand what he wanted me to find. Harold continued. "And Emily, a beat. Don't just watch what Linda touched." His voice dropped. "Watch where she was looking." I opened the security camera app on my phone. The footage was still there. Linda and Gerald walked into the living room. I fast-forwarded to the moment I got up and went into the kitchen for some water. On the screen, Gerald stayed seated at the table. Linda stood up. She looked at Walter's photograph on the shelf. Then at the bookcase, the table by the window. Nothing seemed unusual. Linda didn't open any drawers. She didn't pick anything up. In fact, she barely touched anything at all. But before she returned to her chair, Linda stopped, right in front of the small wooden cabinet, at the far end of the room. Only for a few seconds. Then she walked away. I rewound the footage, watched it again. This time, I wasn't watching Linda's hands. I was watching her eyes. Her gaze moved from the top of the cabinet down to the bottom drawer. Then Linda went back to the table. Just before I came back into the room, I called Harold. "The cabinet." He didn't ask what I meant. "Walter gave it to you almost a year ago, didn't he?" "Yes." I looked toward the far end of the room. The cabinet had been there so long. I'd almost forgotten the day Walter brought it over. He'd rested his hand on the wood, then said, "There's something inside. You don't need to open it yet." I'd laughed. I thought he meant some old papers, or maybe something he wanted me to keep. But before he left, Walter added, "If there ever comes a day when Harold tells you to look inside, That's when you open it. Back then. I didn't ask why. Now I wished I had. Harold. I stared at the cabinet. Is this that day? Yes. One word. I knelt in front of the cabinet, opened the bottom drawer. Behind a few old files was a small box. I carried it over to the table. It wasn't locked. No money, no jewelry, no property documents. Just a leather-bound notebook. I opened the first page and recognized the handwriting immediately. Walter's. 5 days earlier, I'd watched his casket being lowered into the ground. Now, his handwriting was right in front of me again. There were only a few lines on the first page. Emily. If Harold tells you to open this notebook, then the things I was worried about probably didn't go away on their own. Don't jump to conclusions. Read everything in order. I turned the page. At first, there was nothing unusual. Doctor's appointments, a meeting, repairs to the lake house. Little notes an older man might write down, so he wouldn't forget. Then, I saw Linda's name. April 11th. I stopped. Walter had written, Linda asked how much the lake house was worth. That was all. No accusation, no speculation. But directly underneath it, Walter had added one more sentence. Shorter this time. Didn't ask about my health. I read it again. Didn't ask about my health. This time. I wasn't looking at the notebook as a collection of ordinary notes anymore. Walter hadn't written that Linda had done anything wrong. He hadn't claimed to know what she wanted. He had simply started writing down the questions she asked. I turned to the next page, then the next, and Linda's name appeared again, along with another question, then another. By then, I finally understood what Harold wanted me to see. The question about the value of the lake house was only the first one. I kept reading. April 23rd, Walter had written, Linda asked what would happen if Emily didn't want to sell the house. I turned a few more pages. Another note. Linda brought up again that Emily had lived away from home for years. Then, another line. She said Emily's father should have more say in managing the property. I set the notebook down. None of those statements proved anything on their own. Asking how much a house was worth wasn't a crime. Asking who had the right to sell it wasn't either. But when I put those questions side by side, I began to see what Walter had seen, the value of the house. What would happen if I refused to sell? The fact that I'd lived away from the family, my father's rights, all of it, kept coming back to the same question. Who would get to make the decisions? But the part that bothered me most wasn't Linda, it was me. Walter had been sitting there alone, writing down the things that worried him, and I hadn't even known they were happening. I'd served in the military for 13 years. There were years when I only made it home for short visits. I missed birthdays. There were phone calls. I meant to return the next day. Walter never blamed me. Whenever I asked, "Are you okay?" he almost always said, "I'm fine." And I believed him, each time on its own. It never seemed like much, but added together, those moments had turned into years. Sitting there with Walter's handwriting in front of me, I had to admit something I could never go back and change. I hadn't been there for him, as much as I should have been. I kept reading. Near the bottom of one page, there was a line that was completely different. Nothing about the house. Nothing about my father. Walter had simply written, "Ask Harold about Linda's previous divorce." I read it again. I knew Linda had been married before she met my father, but I'd never asked much about it. I called Harold. He answered after a few rings. "What did you find?" A line about Linda's previous marriage. Harold went quiet. I asked, "Walter knew about it?" "Yes." "He wanted you to look into it?" "Yes." "What was he looking for?" Harold's answer was brief. "Property." I looked down at the notebook. So Walter thought Linda was planning to do something like that again? No. Harold cut me off immediately. "Don't go beyond what we know." I stayed quiet. He continued. Walter wasn't accusing Linda of anything. He just wanted to understand what had happened before. Is there really a difference? A very big one. The next morning, I went to Harold's office. There were only two files on his desk. One was thin and related to Linda's previous marriage. The other was much thicker. Walter's name was on the cover. I sat down. Which one matters more? Harold didn't touch Linda's file. He placed his hand on the one with Walter's name. This one. I looked at him. Harold opened the file. Then he said something that made everything I'd just read more complicated. Emily, before Walter began having doubts about that arrangement, he slid a document toward me. He was the one who originally asked for your father to manage the property with you. Harold slid the file toward me. I looked down at the first page. Walter's name, my name, and right beside them, my father's name. I read it again. Grandpa really wanted my father involved in managing the property with me? Harold nodded. Yes. He didn't open the draft right away. Instead, Harold pulled the thinner file closer. Let's deal with this first. It was the file about Linda's previous marriage. There were no criminal accusations, no proven fraud, no evidence that Linda had ever taken anyone's property, just a long divorce, and a dispute over who had the right to make decisions about a piece of real estate. I looked at Harold. So Walter saw this and started becoming suspicious of Linda? Maybe. But it doesn't prove Linda did anything wrong. I looked down at the file. Then why are you showing it to me? Because Walter saw it. Harold closed the file. And maybe after that, he started asking different questions. Then Harold opened the file with Walter's name on it. He pulled out the draft. The date at the top came before the notes in Walter's notebook, which meant that before Walter started writing down Linda's questions, he'd had a different plan. I read it line by line. Walter had once asked for an arrangement to be prepared, where my father would help me manage part of the estate, the property and assets Walter would leave behind. It wasn't Linda's version of what Walter wanted. It wasn't Gerald's interpretation. It was right there in front of me. Why? I asked. Harold sat down. Walter thought your father could help. He was Walter's son-in-law. He was your father. And at the time, Walter believed having both of you involved might bring the family closer together. I looked at my father's name again. So Linda didn't make this up? No, Harold answered. Not this part. That answer bothered me more than a denial would have. Ever since Linda walked into my house, I'd assumed that if I could just find enough evidence, everything would eventually divide into two clear sides. What Linda said, and what Walter actually wanted. But the document in front of me wouldn't let me do that. Walter really had considered shared control, giving both my father and me a say in managing the property, and if we wanted to understand why he changed his mind, we couldn't pretend this part had never existed. I asked, so Walter changed his mind later? Harold looked at me. We're not there yet. But you know the answer. I know the records have an order. He rested his hand on the draft. And if we want other people to respect Walter's final decision, then we have to respect the decisions he considered before he made it. That afternoon, Harold's phone alerted him to a new email. He read the first few lines. Then his expression changed. Linda has formally requested mediation. Gerald had attached a list of documents they planned to use. The old draft was at the top of the list. That didn't surprise me, but the item underneath it made me stop. Audio recording. Walter. I looked at Harold. They have a recording of Grandpa? The file was among the materials Walter left behind while he was putting his estate plan together, the instructions for how his property and assets would be handled. Gerald is using part of it. Which part? Harold turned the screen toward me. Under the file name, there was only a short transcript. I read it. Emily shouldn't control everything by herself. I stared at those words for a long time. This time, it wasn't Linda speaking for Walter. It wasn't Gerald explaining what Walter meant. It wasn't a draft Walter might have changed later. Those were Walter's own words, 3 days later. I'd have to sit across from Linda in a mediation room And for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't wondering what Linda was hiding anymore. I was wondering something far more uncomfortable. What if she wasn't hiding anything at all? 3 days later, I sat across from Linda in the mediation room. Harold sat to my right, on the other side of the table. My father sat beside Linda. Gerald opened his file. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse me of anything. He simply said, "We're not asking for ownership to be transferred. We're proposing shared management, giving both Emily and her father a say in managing the property, consistent with an arrangement Walter himself once considered." He placed the old draft on the table. My father's name was still there beside mine. Linda looked over at me. Emily has had her own life for years. Her father was the one who stayed. I didn't argue, because what made those words hurt was that part of them was true. I had left home. I'd missed calls. There were times Walter told me he was fine, and I didn't ask anything more. And now, right in front of me was proof that Walter really had considered letting my father help manage the property. Gerald continued. But we don't have to speculate about what Walter thought. He took out his phone. He said it himself. Gerald pressed play. Walter's voice filled the room. I recognized him from the very first words. Emily shouldn't control everything by herself. Then, the recording stopped. No one said anything. My father looked down at the table. Linda placed a hand on his arm. This was never about taking anything away from Emily, she said. Walter simply wanted the family to protect what he left behind together. I looked at my father. He still wouldn't look at me. I could say Linda was using Walter's words to her advantage. I could say Gerald was trying to turn 8 seconds into a much bigger story. But there was one thing I couldn't deny. That was Walter's voice, and he really had said those words. I turned toward the mediator. I wasn't here enough. My father looked up. I should have called Walter more often. I should have come home more. I looked back at the file. But the fact that I didn't do enough doesn't mean 8 seconds can speak for everything Walter wanted, Gerald answered. They're still Walter's words. Harold spoke for the first time. Yes. Then he looked at Gerald. How long is the original recording? Gerald didn't answer right away. He turned a page in his file. Almost 2 minutes. Harold looked at him. And is this the entire recording? No. Then we'd like the full recording. Linda spoke up. The rest doesn't change the meaning. Harold turned toward her. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse her. He simply said, then there shouldn't be any problem with us hearing it. The mediation ended without an agreement being signed. I gathered my papers. Linda walked past me, then stopped. Emily, I looked at her. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't finding out someone lied to you. She looked down at Walter's draft. It's accepting that they never said what you wanted to hear. Linda walked away. I didn't answer, because at that moment, I didn't know she was wrong. If you also believe a person shouldn't be judged by 8 seconds taken out of a much larger story, leave a like. When Harold and I were the only ones left in the room, I asked, what if Linda's right? Harold looked at me. What if the rest doesn't change the meaning? He closed the file. He didn't reassure me. He didn't tell me Walter had definitely been on my side. He simply said, then we'll have to accept what Walter actually wanted. I looked at the phone Gerald had just used to play the recording. 8 seconds. Just 8 seconds. But for the first time since Linda walked into my house, I wasn't sure I was trying to prove her wrong anymore. I just wanted to know what Walter said in the rest of that recording. 2 days later, the original recording was sent to Harold's office. I went there first thing that morning. Harold placed his laptop in the middle of the table. He didn't say anything. On the screen, there was only one audio file. I looked at the length, 1 minute and 53 seconds. At the mediation, we'd heard 8 seconds. Harold looked at me. Ready? I nodded. He pressed play. Walter's voice came through the speakers. Emily shouldn't control everything by herself. The exact same words, the exact same voice. But this time, the recording didn't stop. Walter continued. If there ever comes a time when her health or circumstances leave her unable to make those decisions for herself. I looked up. Just a few more words. And the meaning had changed. Walter continued. But right now, Emily is fully capable of making her own decisions. Another voice on the recording asked about the arrangement that would let my father help manage the estate. Walter didn't deny it. I considered it. He's Emily's father. I thought it might bring the family closer together. I looked at Harold. The draft was real. Walter had wanted it once. But then, his tone changed. Lately, Linda's been asking too many questions about the house. Who has the right to sell it? Who has to sign? Walter paused. What worries me isn't just the questions. It's that lately, she isn't asking me anymore. A brief pause. She started asking Emily's father. I didn't take my eyes off the screen. Walter continued. I don't know what Linda intends to do, but if I let him help manage it, I need to be sure his decisions are really his own. Then the recording ended. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. I'd thought I would feel relieved. I didn't. Walter hadn't said Linda was a bad person. He hadn't said she was plotting to take the house. He'd only described the things that had started to worry him. And what hurt the most was knowing he'd had to notice all of it on his own, while I didn't even know it was happening. At our next meeting, Harold asked for the full recording to be entered into the record. Gerald didn't object. The recording began. This time, I didn't look at the phone. I watched my father. The same 8 seconds played. Then the recording continued. When Walter said I was still fully capable of making my own decisions, my father didn't move. When Walter admitted he'd once wanted my father involved in managing the estate, he lowered his head slightly. But when Walter said Linda had started asking him about the house, my father looked up, very slowly. He turned toward Linda. She didn't look back. Then came Walter's final words. I need to be sure his decisions are really his own. My father set his pen down on the table. Linda spoke first. Walter was only speculating. Harold nodded. Yes. Linda looked at him. Harold continued. The recording doesn't prove that you did anything wrong. And it doesn't prove Walter never wanted Emily's father involved in managing the estate. We already know he did. Harold rested his hand on the file. But it does help explain why Walter began reconsidering that decision. My father looked at him. Reconsidering? Harold didn't answer. The meeting was paused. Gerald stood. Linda left with him. My father didn't. He stayed in his chair, staring at the pen he'd just set down. After a moment, he turned to me. Emily, I need to speak with you alone. We went into the small room next door. My father closed the door. He didn't sit down. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out an old envelope. I recognized the handwriting. Before he even placed it on the table. Walter's. Then I saw my name, written across the center. Emily. I looked up. What is this? My father didn't answer right away. Walter gave it to me before he died. I looked at the envelope, then at him. Then why have I never seen it? My father lowered his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Because Linda told me. He stopped. Not to give it to you. I looked at my name on the envelope. Walter's handwriting was unmistakable. I looked at my father. Linda told you not to give this to me? He nodded. She said Walter was weak by then, that he wasn't thinking clearly anymore. And you believed her? It took my father a few seconds to answer. I wanted to. Those 3 words said more than any explanation could have. Walter gave me the envelope about 2 weeks before he died. He said if he didn't get another chance to see Harold, I was supposed to give it to you. I looked at the envelope in my hands. But you didn't. No? Because of Linda? My father lowered his eyes. She said you'd had your own life for years, that you'd been away from home too long, and that if I gave it to you right after Walter died, you'd think all any of us cared about was the property. He paused. I wanted to believe she was trying to keep the family together. I looked at him. Did you ever ask what I thought? He didn't answer. I opened the envelope. There was no will inside, no document transferring ownership, just a copy of a letter Walter had sent to Harold. I looked at the date. It had been written almost 3 months. That after the shared control draft, I started reading. I no longer believe this arrangement protects Emily's right to make her own decisions. I stopped, then kept reading. Walter didn't accuse Linda of anything. He didn't say she'd manipulated my father. He didn't claim to know what she wanted. He simply documented the things that had made him uncomfortable with the old plan. The questions about the house, who had the right to sell it, who had to sign, and the fact that Linda had started discussing those things with my father instead of Walter. Near the end of the letter, he wrote, "If a decision Emily makes requires someone else's approval, then I need to be certain that the choice still truly belongs to her." The door opened. Harold walked in. I handed him the letter. The first thing he checked was the date. Then he looked at my father. "Walter gave this to you?" "Yes." "Before he died?" My father nodded. Harold placed the letter on the table, beside the old draft. 2 documents, 2 different points in time. Now we have the sequence. Harold pointed to the first document. "Walter once considered shared control, giving both you and your father a say in managing the property." Then he touched the letter. Later, he began questioning whether that arrangement was still appropriate. I looked at Harold. "Does this letter change the estate plan?" "No," he answered immediately. "It only shows that Walter wanted to reconsider the plan." "So did he actually change it?" Harold opened the file. He took out another document and placed it in the middle of the table. The date it was signed was almost 2 weeks after the letter. Walter had gone back to Harold's office. This time, he hadn't simply written down his concerns. He changed his estate plan. I read the section about the house. My father's name was no longer beside mine. Shared control had been removed. The right to make the decisions had been returned to me. I looked at Harold. "So that's the end of it?" "No," he answered too quickly. "Why? Linda isn't denying that Walter signed it. Gerald isn't claiming the signature is fake." Harold placed his finger on the date. "What they're going to challenge is whether Walter on this day still fully understood what he was signing and what that decision would mean." I looked at him. "You mean his mental capacity?" "Yes. Whether he was still able to understand the decision he was making." I looked back at the document. For days, I'd been trying to prove that Walter changed his mind. Now, that very change would be used against him. Linda didn't have to prove that Walter had never wanted me to manage the house on my own. She only had to give the court a reason to question one thing. When Walter made his final decision, was it really still his decision to make? Before we left the room, my father called my name. "Emily," I turned around. He looked at the envelope Walter had entrusted to him. I thought I was keeping the family from falling apart. He looked up. Now I'm not sure who I was protecting. I didn't answer, because by then, what Linda wanted was no longer the biggest question. Who my father had believed wasn't the biggest question either. There was only one thing left, that a judge would have to decide a few weeks later. When Walter put his signature on that final amendment, the document that changed his estate plan, did he still understand exactly what he was doing? A few weeks later, the final hearing began. I arrived early. Harold was already sitting beside me, with the files arranged in order across the table. Linda walked in with Gerald. She sat down on the other side. A few minutes later, my father appeared. I watched him walk through the door. Linda saw him too, but this time, my father didn't walk toward her. He passed Linda's row and sat down, right behind me. No one said anything. There was no need. Gerald stood first. He didn't dispute the signature on the amendment, the document that changed Walter's estate plan. He didn't claim the document was fake, and he didn't deny that Walter had removed shared control. Instead, he placed his hand over the date it had been signed. The question before the court is not whether Walter signed this document. He did. Gerald looked toward the judge. The question is whether, at that time, Walter still had the mental capacity to understand the consequences of the decision he was making. He talked about Walter's age, his declining health, and the short amount of time between the final amendment and his death. Then Gerald said, "We are not challenging the signature. We are challenging the capacity of the man who signed it." I looked at the document in front of Harold. For weeks, I'd believed that if I could just prove Walter really had changed his mind, it would all be over. But now, that final decision itself was the thing being questioned. Harold stood. He wasn't carrying the notebook, only Walter's legal file. "The other side is questioning Walter's ability to make this decision," he said. "So, let's look at what he actually did." During that same period of time, Harold placed the first draft on the table. Walter had once considered shared control. No one disputed that. Then came the notes showing that he'd begun to have concerns. Then the letter asking for the management arrangement to be reconsidered. And almost 2 weeks later, the final amendment, each document placed beside the next in chronological order. This wasn't a decision made in a single afternoon. It was a process that unfolded over several months. Harold turned toward Gerald. Linda's side asked us to trust Walter's words, when 8 seconds of a recording supported their argument. Gerald looked at him. Harold continued. But when Walter himself made a decision that no longer supported that argument, we're being asked to believe he no longer understood what he was doing. Gerald stood. Words alone do not establish legal capacity. Harold nodded. Correct. Which is why we don't have only words. He opened the file from the day Walter signed the amendment. There were notes from his attorney, confirmation from a witness, and before Walter signed, he had been asked to explain, in his own words, what the document would change. Harold read the recorded response. "Emily will not need anyone else's signature to make decisions about the house." It wasn't legal jargon. It wasn't a sentence Harold had written for him. Walter knew who had the authority. He knew which restriction he was removing, and he knew who would have the right to decide afterward. The judge reviewed the record. No one in the courtroom said a word. Finally, he looked up. The evidence before the court shows that Walter did more than simply change his mind. He documented his concerns. He requested a change, and before signing, he was able to explain the consequences of that change. The judge set the file down. The court finds insufficient grounds to invalidate the amendment. A beat. The request is denied. I didn't turn toward Linda. I didn't look at Gerald. I only heard Harold close the file beside me. Across the room, Linda said nothing. She looked down at the table. And for the first time, since the day she'd walked into my house with an attorney, Linda was no longer the one deciding which part of the story got heard. Outside the courtroom, I heard my father call my name. "Emily." I turned around. He stood a few steps away. Linda wasn't beside him. My father looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I let someone turn the fact that you left home into proof that you'd abandoned your family." I didn't tell him everything was okay, because it wasn't. No court ruling could undo everything that had happened between us. I simply looked at him and said, "I know." A few days later, I returned to Walter's house. No attorneys, no files, no one arguing over who had the right to manage anything, just me and the leather-bound notebook. I sat at the table by the window, where Walter used to drink his coffee every morning. On the final page, there was a passage I hadn't read before. The handwriting was shakier than it had been on the earlier pages, but it was still Walter's. "Emily has spent too many years living by duty and responsibility." I kept reading. "I'm not leaving her the house because she needs the money." Then I reached the final line. I read it once, then again. "I'm leaving it to her so that this time, the decision belongs to her." I looked around the house. For weeks, all of us had argued about ownership, control, who had to sign, who had the right to decide. But in the end, Walter had never simply left me a house. He'd left me the right to decide what I would do with it. If you'd like to hear more stories about family, honor, and the truths that only emerge when we finally hear the whole story, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next story.